Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s author event with Jason Stearns. I'm Heidi Shue, President of the Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. Our guest, Jason Stearns, his new book is Dancing in the Glory of Monsters, The Collapse of the Congo and the Great War of Africa. Jason Stearns has been working on the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the past 10 years. He first traveled to the Congo in 2001 to work for a local human rights organization, and then he went on to work for the United Nations Peacekeeping Mission and as a senior analyst for the International Crisis Group. In 2008, he was named by the UN Secretary General to lead the UN group of experts on the Congo. There are few conflict histories more difficult to explain than that of the Eastern Congo. It is safe to say that for most Americans, the history of the Congo is shrouded in mystery. We are aware of years of conflict and wars, but only vaguely aware of the complexity of issues, peoples, and geopolitical wrangling that are involved. In Dancing in the Glory of Monsters, Jason asks the question, how do you cover a war that involves at least 20 different rebel groups and the armies of 9 countries, yet does not seem to have a clear cause or objective? He then follows with one of the most comprehensive explanations in print today, and certainly the most accessible. As one reviewer stated, by bringing to bear the access he has gained through his extensive experience in the region, Stearns tells the story of how the Congo became crippled through external manipulation, internal corruption, and continual conflict, using the stories of individuals who not only lived it, but in many cases were leaders of communities, rebel groups, and the government structures involved. His articles and opinion pieces have appeared in the Financial Times, The Economist, Africa Confidential, The Wall Street Journal, and The Washington Post. He blogs at Congolese, blogspot.com, and is currently pursuing a PhD at Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Jason Stearns.
Thank you very much for coming out. Thank you for taking time away from the Osama mania that's gripped our country. I'm going to have to take you to a place that's rather less alluring than Abbottabad tonight, so please bear with me. And thanks above all to the World Affairs Council for inviting me here. I tend to be a bit peripatetic in the way I talk about the Congo, so bear with me. I'll get to my point eventually. I begin the book with 2 images. The first image is the image of a local militia leader. This was a guy I met traveling to the Eastern Congo several years ago doing research for my book in the remote highlands of the Eastern Congo, and he was about as stereotypical as a warlord you could find. He had an amulet with monkey skulls, he had and bottle caps, he had a bunch of child soldiers milling about, he had a grass skirt, and he was about, if you think African warlord, this guy was probably as close as you could get. So, I said, I would like to interview for my book, and he immediately said, what's your agenda? I said, I don't have an agenda, I'm a journalist, I want to interview for my book. He said, no, everybody has an agenda. What's your agenda? And I said, no, I just want to hear your story. I want to know what the war was like for you. I want to hear your own experiences. And he wasn't going to have any of this. He thought I was, something much more nefarious than a simple journalist. And then, before I left, I said, well, could I at least take your picture? And he said, no, you can't take my picture. You're going to take my picture and take it off to Ulaya, to Europe, where a bunch of Wazungu are going to look at the picture and think I'm some crazy macaque or African monkey warlord with a bunch of monkey skulls around my neck. That's what they're going to think I am. No, you can't take my picture. Now, I tell this story because, to a certain extent, he was right. The second image, I'll explain to you why he was right. The second image I invoke at the beginning of my book is of a gentleman called Otabenga. Otabenga was a pygmy from the central Kasai region in the Congo who was brought to the United States in 1904 by American missionaries and exhibited in the Bronx Zoo in New York City in the monkey house next to orangutans. And there were op-eds, including in the New York Times, that sort of lauded this exhibit and said, this is an example of evolution and look how far we have come. So perhaps the reason I put these two stories next to each other, while perhaps the images in the press and the media of the Congo today are not as shockingly racist as Otabenga being brought to you. By the way, if you've seen the movie The Something Something Life of Benjamin Button, there's a pygmy in the movie that's supposed to be Otabenga. So the depictions we see in the press these days of the conflict in the Congo are not quite as, certainly not as shockingly racist as bringing a pygmy and putting him in the monkey house in the Bronx Zoo. But they do often, unfortunately, reduce the conflict to a caricature of itself. It becomes a dance of savage African warlords killing and raping through the country in order to get at the mineral wealth or the money. And I think that these cliches are not very helpful. They don't help us to understand the deep causes of the conflict or devise potential solutions. So the real impulse behind this book was me living in the Eastern Congo for the better part of 10 years and sharing war stories over beers with Congolese politicians and commanders, and just having the deep feeling that there was something about this conflict that was not being portrayed. And as long as we haven't understood that these people are living, breathing humans with interests and incentives of their own, who do things, they may do terrible things, but they do things for good reasons. Until we understand that and understand their stories, we're still going to be trapped in this. We're going to be trapped in these caricatures that unfortunately the media resorts to in telling the story. So, so what does this book do? The book tells the story of the Congo War, and I'll get there. I promise I'll get to the story of the Congo War. From the point of view of the people who lived through it. I don't really appear in the book. I appear in the book as a guy going and interviewing people, but it's not my story. It's a story of the Congolese, the Rwandans, the Ugandans, et cetera, who lived through the war, who were the protagonists in this war. And it has two purposes. One, the basic purpose that I'm not really going to get to tonight, is to explain what happened. It's sort of the ABC of the Congo War. If 5.4 million people have died, and those are the statistics, then how the hell was this possible? The second point of the book is a bit more philosophical. And it's almost more important. And it gets back to these two stories I just told, and that's about motivation and responsibility. It's an ethical question. If, again, 5.4 million people died, how do we apportion blame and responsibility for this? And if we have to go beyond the cliche of savage rebel leaders and try to understand the motives of the involved, what were those motives? So on this question of responsibility, I think the Congo poses an ethical challenge to us that's serious, and we think we need to consider front on. Another story I tell at the beginning of the book was one that you probably will be familiar with, which is of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 in Jerusalem. Now, Adolf Eichmann, as many of you will know, was the Nazi official responsible for the transportation of hundreds of thousands of Jews to the concentration camps. He was then found by Israeli secret services in Argentina, kidnapped and deported or exported or whatever you want to Israel, where he stood trial. And Hannah Arendt, the famous German philosopher, went to this trial with the goal of trying to understand if so many of my countrymen and so many of my fellow Jews had to die in the Second World War, then why was it? How was it humanly possible for this person to do this? And her conclusion, famously, was that it was this massive state bureaucracy that allowed for Adolf Eichmann really just trying to do his job. He didn't have anything against the Jews. He was actually, he calls himself a Zionist, believe it or not, at one point in the trial, and that he was just trying to get ahead in life. And it was this massive state bureaucracy that dehumanized the victims and allowed for, as she puts it, the industrial production of corpses. And that is what she called the banality of evil. He was a guy just doing his job, and he ended up being complicit and being responsible for massive human suffering. So the reason I'm telling this story is, imagine Hannah Arendt going to the Congo. And instead of going to Jerusalem in 1961, she goes to the Congo to try to understand what is evil in the Congo War. 5.4 million people died. How do we apportion blame and responsibility? And in many ways, so on some levels, the Congo is very similar. The level of death and suffering, you could say 5.4 million. It's actually probably more than that. Statistics are coming out this coming week that indicate that 400,000 women a year are being raped in the Congo. I mean, it boggles the mind. It's a suffering on a scale that it's almost impossible to conceptualize. So on one level, it's similar to the Rwandan genocide, the Cambodian genocide, even the Jewish Holocaust. But there's something very different about the Congo. In the Congo, it was not the massive state bureaucracy that was very systematically, in an organized fashion, intent on exterminating a race. And it was not the mass production of corpses in gas chambers in a very explicit, intentful way. It was not the mass eradication or attack against Tutsi in Rwanda, for example, by genocidal militias in 1994. Instead, here you have a conflict where, even though more than 5 million people have died, only about 500,000, only I say with a great deal of air quotes, only about 500,000 were killed in direct combat, were killed by a machete or a gun. All of the rest of them were killed as a consequence of the war, very unsensationally, perishing due to hunger and disease someplace in the forest away from a TV camera and from the rest of the world. It was not a conflict where you had easily identifiable two sides, where you had heroes and villains, good guys, bad guys, or even authors and victims, perpetrators and victims. It was a conflict, as the introduction pointed out, where you had 9 different African countries. I've counted over 42 different armed groups who were all acting for reasons they felt made sense, but reasons that are very complex. So this, to a certain extent, has been the curse of the Congo. Complexity has been a curse of the Congo. If the fact that it's much more difficult to describe and to get narrative leverage on the conflict has meant that people don't care about it. I used to live in the Eastern Congo, and I'd have friends of mine, journalist friends of mine, come and visit the Eastern Congo, and they would just be wringing their hands. How am I supposed to tell the story in 800 words? What's going on here? A lot of people are dying, a lot of people are suffering, but it's so complex, I can't reduce this, I can't suck the juice out of the story in 800 words. It's impossible. So they would then resort to more cliches. They'd either resort to just talking about the suffering, or they resort to these cliches of savage warlords, et cetera, et cetera. So, as a result of this complexity that, to a certain extent, the Congo is cursed with, I think there's been 2 main reactions in the United States, and both of them are problematic. The first one, I think, is most obvious, which is basically apathy. We don't care as much about something that we have a harder time understanding. Something you try to explain to somebody in a sentence. I try to explain to somebody in like 20 seconds what the Congo War is about, and you're going to struggle. And I think as a result of that, you care less. And the apathy has just been overwhelming in the United States, in all of the world. The second reaction, I think, to the conflict is almost as troubling, which is trying to pick heroes and to pick winners where there really are none. And there's many examples of this. The one example I talk about in the book is with regards to the Rwandan government. The Rwandan government of Paul Kagame, who is currently in power in Rwanda, was a visionary government in many ways in terms of rebuilding its own country after the genocide. In 1994, they took over a country that had been completely devastated, with providing health care and education for its people. It's made strides that are seen in fewer of the countries in the region. But I say that it's problematic because at the same time, this government was responsible for massive human rights abuses in the neighboring Congo. In 1996, they were the main sponsor of the rebel group that toppled Mobutu Sese Seko in 1997 actually. And they broke up the refugee camps in the process of which they probably killed something on the order of tens of thousands of refugees. And then they occupied the eastern Congo for many years, in the process of which they and their proxy rebel groups were responsible for the deaths of thousands of Congolese civilians. So it's this fact that we can't walk and chew gum at the same time. We can't say you've done a great job of rebuilding Rwanda and you know what, we're going to bankroll you, which is what the United States and other donors did for the better part of 15 years. And at the same time trying to engage in a meaningful fashion in the neighboring Congo. And I think to a certain extent, this is a product as well of the fact that you just don't care enough. Apathy has produced a situation where, okay, we're going to care, but we're going to care in a very simplistic fashion. And that as well comes with a lot of enormous amount of problems associated with it. So that's my preamble. And maybe just to finish my preamble, I'm going to say a little bit about the title of the book that's either people love or they hate. And I must say I love it and I hate it myself. But let me explain a little bit where it comes from, because it feeds into this whole thing on my like I said, my peripatetic introduction here. It feeds into all of this because it tries to sort of encapsulate this notion that we shouldn't continuously try to find, sort of personalize the evil in the Congo. It's kind of like what Hannah Arendt did with Eichmann. It's like Eichmann, he's a nobody. She went to Jerusalem and it's like she saw a vacuum in the trial chamber in Jerusalem. Eichmann is not we need to understand the system that could produce somebody like this and that could allow somebody who's just trying to get ahead to carry out such atrocious acts. And the same sort of thing is the case with the Congo. Let's stop trying to find the latest, greatest Congolese warlord that we can point our finger at and blame, whether it's Nkunda or Kagame or Kabila or you name it. Let's try to understand the political system that seems time and time again to promote people who are relatively ruthless. A good friend of mine who's a Congolese parliamentarian said, Jason, you don't understand. If either you're a little bit corrupt and a little bit abusive, or you get nowhere in the Congo. Another friend put it a different way. He said, if you parachuted Mahatma Gandhi into the Congo, he'd end up like everybody else here. And another friend of mine called it the reverse Midas effect, which he said, everything that Congolese politics touches turns to shit. So there's different ways of putting it, but and so why the title? The title, "Dancing in the Glory of Monsters," is a quote from Laurent Kabila, who replaced Mobutu Sese Seko as at the helm of the Congo. And as they were fighting their way across the country, although Laurent Kabila didn't do very much of the fighting, he'd be confronted by these huge masses of people who were celebrating the demise of Mobutu and celebrating the liberation of the Congo. And they were overjoyed. And in Mbujimai, in the center of the Congo, he was confronted by this crowd that was screaming, "Down with Mobutu, down with Mobutu." And he confronted the crowd and he started haranguing them. And he said, all of you screaming "down with Mobutu" here, do you think Mobutu's the real problem in the Congo? All of you guys were, administrative officials taking bribes. I didn't see any of you out in the streets, protesting and trying to overthrow Mobutu. It's not about the man, it's about the system. It's about the mal Zaïrois. It's about the country. And he said, I have seen all of you dancing in the glory of the monster. So let's stop focusing on the monster and let's start focusing on the dance, on this political system that has produced the guy. Now, unfortunately, some people, the reason people hate my book is, and the reason I was very reluctant using the title is, you put monster in a book about the Congo and automatically some people are going to start thinking that it's actually the opposite of what I'm trying to do, that I'm actually trying to promote the idea that there are monsters in the Congo. The whole book is about the fact that you need to put yourself, walk a mile in their shoes, and then judge them. And I tell the story time and time again, if you read the book, about different people who would interrupt me while I was interviewing them and saying, this interview is all fair and well, but do you really think you can understand me? I killed 100 people in a day. Do you think you can understand that? And then, they'd sort of smile and say, well, who cares? You're not going to understand it, but I'm going to tell you my story anyway. And they were right to a certain extent. I mean, I would never condone the killing of innocents or even extrajudicial killings in any shape or form, but unless you've grown up in these circumstances, it becomes it's a different story. So that's my preamble. So let me talk a little bit about the book before we can open up to question and answers, so I can talk about things that interest you and not just things that interest me. So the book unpacks the conflict into, so here's when somebody on the radio asks me, okay, so the Congo is complex, and we need to understand this complexity. What's the 30-second spiel on the Congo War? So here's my 30-second spiel on the Congo War. 3 causes. 1, the collapse of the Congo over 32 years of abusive dictatorship by Mobutu Sese Seko, backed by various donors, including the United States. Number 2, genocide in neighboring Rwanda that drove 1 million refugees across the border into the Congo, including the perpetrators of the genocide. And number 3, festering local conflicts, in particular in the very densely populated eastern Congo, that had been exacerbated by this very fact that Mobutu had run his country into the ground over 32 years, and that he was a master of this divide and rule politics, and exacerbated by these regional effects, that contamination of violence from neighboring Rwanda and Burundi. So that's the spiel. And I go into that in great detail in the book. I'm not going to bore you with all of that, but I do want to pick out a couple of different things. First, let me talk a little bit about Rwanda. It's incredibly difficult to write about Rwanda. Everybody I know, my friends who write about Rwanda, suffer the fate of being lumped into a pro-Rwanda category or an anti-Rwanda category, usually meaning pro-RPF or anti-RPF, the ruling government, the ruling party. And I am sure I will suffer that fate as well. Now, to be clear, I'm going to try to, and we could speak for hours about Rwandan responsibility for what happened in the Congo, and it's a very complex issue. In 1996, Rwanda invaded with a fairly good reason. It invaded, in largely speaking, in self-defense. The civil war in Rwanda that had culminated in the genocide had driven across the border the opponents of the RPF. In fact, the genocide was sort of the last spasm of the incumbent government before they fled across the border into the eastern Congo. And so what happened with the flight into the eastern Congo was not the end of the Rwandan civil war. In fact, their flight into the eastern Congo was just a truce or a ceasefire in the Rwandan civil war. And to a certain extent, the beginning phase, or the next 7 years of the Congo War, was partially a continuation of the Rwandan civil war, in part. So, Paul Kagame came to Washington in 1996, and he told the State Department, he met with Colin Powell and with members of the State Department. He told them, if you don't go in and dismantle the refugee camps, I will. He told them. So the United States government, that had failed, along with its international allies, to intervene to bring an end to the genocide, and that had then sort of rubbed salt into that insult, into that wound, by not only not breaking up the refugee camps and demilitarizing them as was required by international law, but actually funding, throwing a lot of aid deservedly to keep the refugees alive because they were dying of cholera and other diseases, but inadvertently then also funding these armed groups that were based out of the refugee camps. So from the Rwandan point of view, I mean, the U.S. and the international community, it was the height of hypocrisy. You guys don't help us out during the genocide. Now you're feeding the guys who perpetrated the genocide, and you're telling us we can't intervene to defend our own borders. This is absurd. Okay, if you don't want to do it, then we'll do it. And that's what happened in 1996. Rwanda invaded, and they knew they couldn't invade as an international power because, as the president of Uganda pointed out to his colleague in Rwanda, international system doesn't like foreign aggression. So let's make this look like a rebellion, which is what happens. But it was Rwanda, largely speaking, that was behind it, together with Angola and Uganda. And they broke up the refugee camps. So I think that we need to understand that there's not a black and white story here of Rwanda being the victim or Rwanda being the perpetrator. They invaded at that point with complex motives, largely out of self-defense, and their motives remained complex throughout the conflict. Now, the fact that they had complex motives does not justify in any shape or form the massive abuses that they carried out in the Eastern Congo. But we need to recognize that. And too often it's this what they call the, in French, a dialogue of deaf people between the people who say it's Rwanda's to blame, the whole war is Rwanda's fault, and the people who say that Rwanda was a victim in all of this and they were justified. And so I try to bring a little bit more conceptual clarity to this issue in the book. But I think this is the problem. This was a huge problem in terms of U.S. foreign policy. When under Clinton, when Susan Rice, who's now our ambassador at the UN, was the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, she, many other people, John Prendergast, who's now heads up the Enough Project, a whole host of other people who are still around now in some shape or form, we're trying, I think, really tried to find heroes where there were no heroes. And I think the impact of that was deeply nefarious for the people of the Eastern Congo. I interviewed, in my book, I mentioned interviewing Howard Wolpe, who was the special envoy of the U.S. of Clinton administration for Africa, for the Great Lakes region at that point. And I pressed him on this issue of the abuses being committed by Rwanda and their rebel allies in the Eastern Congo, the RCD, in the 1998-2000 period when he was special envoy. Excuse me. And he said, well, we just didn't know enough what was going on. We heard reports of these abuses, but we weren't sure if they were true or not. And it's complicated, and that's true. It's incredibly complicated. But that shouldn't be, not knowing, if you're literally, the Rwandan government was being funded between 50 to 80% of their budget was coming from foreign donors. Not knowing at that point is just not good enough. You can't just say, oh, well, we're going to give them a lot of money, but we really don't know what's going on in the Eastern Congo. As I detail in my book, thousands of Congolese were being butchered in the Eastern Congo. And that was, I think, our point. If you fund the government to the tune of 80% of the budget, you bear responsibility, and I try to argue this in the book. Now, another issue I try to deal with to a certain extent is the role of minerals in financing the war. Now I find myself in a bit of a strange position, having dealt with the Congo War for 10 years now, and many of my friends for much longer than that. And for the most part of the time that I've been involved in the Congo, you couldn't get anybody to care in Washington and New York and around the world. It was difficult to get people to care. It was too obscure, too complex, so they really wouldn't care about it too much. Now, after the peace deal happened, after elections have happened, after war has stopped in the majority of the country, although it's gotten worse in parts of the East, now you have a grassroots movement born basically in the United States that has caused our leaders to care. We had Obama sponsoring a bill on the Congo. We've had the Dodd-Frank Act last year of July that includes an article on regulating conflict minerals in the Congo specifically. You have Oprah dedicating shows, you have people writing books, you have celebrities, a whole gaggle of celebrities who travel there and do activism on this issue. And it's largely speaking around two issues, around sexual violence and around conflict minerals. And I have mixed feelings about this. It's wonderful that people care about the Congo. We've been trying to do, me and friends of mine over the last 10 years, is get people to care about the suffering of the Congolese people. The reason I say it's strange is because, as I think you may have realized in my rather long preamble, the Congo War is not about conflict minerals, and it's not specifically about sexual violence. And the unfortunate consequence of reducing it to these two things is that people get the impression that it's a bunch of savages raping women in order to get at minerals, which is literally the narrative depicted by some of these organizations. And so I have a debate with people like John Prendergast, who's a friend of mine, and other people who say, look, we know it's more complex than that, but we need to get people in Peoria, Illinois to care about it. And I agree, but so the question is, how much do you dumb it down in order to make people care about it? How much do you actually, I wouldn't say lie, but how much do you reduce the complexity of it in order to make people care about it. And at a certain point, you do begin fudging the facts in order to get people to care about it. So, from my point of view, the Congo is complex, but don't underestimate the capacity of an average American to understand complexity. If you tell people that 400,000 women are being raped a year, then you can deal with a little bit of complexity to understand why 400,000 women are being raped a year. So we have that disagreement back and forth. But anyway, this goes back to minerals in the conflict. What were the role of minerals in the conflict? And I talk about this because it's an important aspect of the conflict. Minerals, but also international trade, international corporate system, you could say. There's an anecdote. I think I cut this out of my book was about a quarter longer than is in the current. My editor said, you're never going to sell a book on the Congo that's 500 pages long. So if you want the extended version, we can talk. I'll give you an extra couple of chapters. In the extended version, one of the stories I tell was me when I just arrived in eastern Congo, sitting on a boat in Lake Kivu, been arrested by the rebels and sent to the rebel capital to get a visa. Long story. Anyway, I was sitting on this boat and a bunch of bananas, and me and this guy got into this conversation. We were talking about the causes of the war and why there was a war in the Congo. And I told him I was from the United States. Oh, he said, oh, you're from the United States. Okay. Do you know Bob Marley? I said, yeah, I know. I mean, he's not from America, but he's like, no, I know he's from Jamaica. But do you know Bob Marley? I was like, yeah, I know Bob Marley. He said, Bob Marley's got this song. It's called Babylon's System. I was like, okay, I know Babylon's System. He's like, yeah, Babylon's System. He started singing it. He said, Babylon's System, it's sucking the blood of the children. And I said, okay, so how does this relate to the Congo? And he said, international global capitalism is sucking the blood of Congolese children. That's what Bob Marley wasn't talking about the Congo, but he was talking about Babylon's system was the system of Babylon, and in part also global capitalism, and that was sucking the blood of the children, in this case, in the Congo. And there's a deep-grained belief in Congolese society that they are the victims of an international conspiracy, of one shape or form. I mean, different people have different opinions about this. But they are convinced, I exaggerate a little bit here, but they're convinced that Congo is a key issue of debate amongst American politicians. That President Obama wakes up and every morning with his morning scone, he gets a Congo briefing. Now, I try to convince them and try to tell them when I come to DC to give a briefing on the Congo to everybody who is anybody working on the Congo in the US government, it's a room of about not even as many people as here tonight. There's about 20 people in the room. It's difficult to get anybody to listen in the United States about the Congo. It's easier now than it was a couple years ago. But there is this feeling. Now, so in the book, I try to examine the truth of this. Now, there is obviously complicity and there's responsibility, and I've talked a little bit about the responsibility. But the kind of engagement you saw by international businessmen and entrepreneurs in the Congolese conflict was not, BHP Billiton flying in, BP flying in. It's not like Texaco and Nigeria or something like that. In fact, the investment climate is so bad in most of the Congo that you'd be insane to invest in the Congo at the moment. I mean, there's been a lot of investment, but it's actually very interesting the way it happens. What happens at the beginning of the war is you get what they call mining cowboys who come in. And these are largely people who used to work for De Beers and for BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto, the big mining giants, but then left. And they left because they knew there was a place in this system for people who were willing to absorb the risk. As I said, you'd be insane if you're Rio Tinto and you're listed on a stock exchange to go in there and try to do deals, because the deals inevitably are going to end up requiring bribery and corruption. So there's this little niche there for entrepreneurs, I call them mining cowboys, to go in and to strike deals and to get their hands basically on the paperwork, on the concessions, stake out concessions. And then you wait for a while and you flip the concessions. And when you flip the concessions and you sell it off to BHP, now you have, the last 5 years, now the big boys start coming in. When you flip the concessions, the big boys are buying a concession from a mining cowboy who's got all the paperwork in order, and there's no corruption, or at least it's not on the surface of it, and he's absorbed all of the dirty work, and he's paid off everybody's need to pay off. So so they don't, on the face of it, when they get audited by the international auditors and all of the other SEC obligations that they have to fulfill, You could even argue that they haven't done anything illegal, because most of the responsibility and liability for that stuff has been absorbed by these mining cowboys, some of whom have hilariously colorful characters that I go into the book a little bit.
If someone wants to not dance, who's there? The bigger question is, where is China?
So there's a question about, is there a viable political movement in the Congo that you could back?
Where do you go if you don't want to dance?
I think there's a temptation to see the Congo as one big mess. And I can't tell you about how many conversations I've had with expats in the Congo who say, oh, Congo is just one big mess. The Congo is not a mess. The Congo has a logic of its own to itself, and a very beautiful logic sometimes. But it is true that Congo has deeply weak state institutions. Now, what I try to say in the book is that there's a history and there's a reason for that. It doesn't have weak state institutions because the Congolese are somehow genetically deficient and can't create strong state institutions. In the 16th century, the Congo Kingdom was one of the strongest kingdoms in Central Africa. In fact, it was so strong it had ambassadors in the Vatican and in Portugal and in Spain. There is history of very strong institutions. Unfortunately, since then, since the 16th century, the Congolese history has been marked by one wave after another of outsiders who have come in and systematically eroded Congolese institutions. First, you had the slave trade. Then you had the terribly exploitative rubber trade with the establishment of the Congo Free State by the Belgian king. And then, of course, you had Mobutu Sese Seko's rule. So even though Americans would be, I think most Americans would be challenged to find Congo on a map, the Congolese have this deep sense that our history is intertwined with the history of the West, precisely because they know this history. And they know that the fact that if today their country is in a big mess and their institutions have been eroded, in part it's because of this. You know, I worked in Congolese civil society for a local Congolese human rights group for a year, and I have many friends who up until today are still working, and some of them are fighting the good fight, and some of them are braving terrible odds and abuse and repression. But many of those friends I had in civil society have now gone into politics as well. And their story, I guess, is probably less admirable, or has often been. So it's not easy to find. So if you were Congolese and you wanted to stand up and be counted with one of these organizations, which one would you pick? It's tough, but it's tough for a good reason for them. You know, it's tough because of this long legacy of abuse. But they'll get there. I mean, I think this is why for elections, for example, this year, there's a strong temptation that I'll hear amongst very high-ranking diplomats to say that, look, Kabila's going to win the elections this year by hook or crook. He's going to win. So why are we going to stand in his way? And you know what? Democracy is a mess in the Congo. And democracy is often another a code name for corruption, because you have to buy all these MPs off in parliament, and it's just a big mess. And diplomats have an ambivalent relationship towards democracy. Yes, it's true. There's not exact opposition in the Congo is not terribly credible, and there's a lot of corruption amongst the opposition and abuse as well. But let's not forget that the leading opposition figure, or one of the leading opposition figures, is sitting in a jail cell in The Hague. Nonetheless, if there is going to be quote unquote a solution to the Congolese problem, it's the Congolese people who are going to bring that about. It's not some foreigner who's going to come and tell the Congolese what to do and save the Congolese. Not only is that wrong, it's patronizing. So here you have the best opportunity in 5 years, and probably in a lot longer than that, to allow the Congolese to make their own choice, for them to go to the polls. Give them the credit and give them the opportunity to be able to do that. You'll find, I think, that most Congolese are much more politically savvy than I think a lot of these diplomats make them out to be. I don't mention China almost at all during this book because they played a negligible role during the war. This is new. And it's important, and I think it's not straightforward. I think many Congolese, the reaction of some Congolese friends of mine is, well, you can't put a road or a hospital in a Swiss bank account. So, at least they're building something that's going to last, as opposed to all this other foreign aid that we sometimes don't see. And it's true, the Chinese have started infrastructure projects that there's no doubt, have improved roads, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, you can't outsource a state to a foreign power. You can't outsource state functions to the Chinese government. You can build hospitals, but who's going to work in the hospitals? You can build roads, but who's going to maintain the roads over the next 10 or 20 years? So I think it's sort of a quick, short-term solution to a very long-term problem, which is about state capacity. So I think there it's problematic. I also think they got a very good deal. I think that they paid very little for a lot of minerals. And the Chinese government is very nifty at doing this. And I think we also, the last thing I'd say about the Chinese is we tend to see them as sort of this monolithic lump. This Chinese government is coming in. It's actually the Chinese government via a lot of parastatal Chinese companies that are affiliated and linked to the Communist Party, but that are not the Chinese government. And they are actually, one thing you can observe in the Congo is all these Chinese companies fighting amongst each other over these different deals and bits.
Why do you think people are more compelled by genocide in the case of Rwanda or disasters in the case of Haiti, not by numbers in the case of Congo? And the way he talks about that people are more maybe responsive to evil as opposed to suffering in the way that I see it. Why do you think so many people, well, let me take that back. Not so many people know about the Congo, but why do you think there's a lack of response? What, because of your travels and your talks with Westerners, European and Americans, what do you think people's reasoning is for that?
The quote you mentioned, I think, is a good quote. It's by Nick Kristof, who's a New York Times columnist, and this is 2006. And Nick Kristof, of course, nowadays is very much preoccupied with the Congo question, and he writes often on it. But back in 2006, somebody challenged him, and somebody said, well, you know, you write so much about Darfur, but just on paper, in terms of human lives, the Congo is much worse than Darfur. And it wasn't even just Kristof. If you look at how many times the Congo is mentioned in newspaper articles, much fewer than Darfur throughout. And Kristof's response to the person who challenged him was, I paraphrase, Sudan is a case of a genocidal government butchering its own civilians. It's a case of evil. Whereas in the Congo, it's more of a mess. I mean, that's definitely a paraphrase, but I think that boils down his argument. And I think that's the challenge of this book to a certain extent. And you know, I think you may have come in a little bit after I began, but I talked at length at the beginning about how I think this does pose a serious challenge, a moral and ethical challenge to us as well. On two dimensions. One, should we care less about a conflict that has more complex responsibility and causality? Should you care more about a conflict just because it's easy to? I mean, if 10 people die, and you can pinpoint the author of their death, should that preoccupy you more? Or if they die and you don't really know why they die, should that preoccupy you just as much? I mean, we see this in the media all the time. This year, as opposed to most years, we actually have a very good opportunity to allow Congolese to address their own problems. And it's disappointing to see that the United States government, as well as other governments, have not really taken this opportunity. It's very disappointing.
I spent 10 years in Congo as well. Went in 95, came out in 2005. When I got into Kinshasa in 95, it was lots of radio that I heard constantly in the neighborhoods. I never saw anything get so much attention as Tutsi, Banyamulenge. I mean, it was like fuel on a fire, this nationalism, this incredible nationalism. It was so hard to understand, and Kinshasa was like a flaming political cesspool at the time. I mean, it was just you couldn't go anywhere without talking the East. When I went to the East the first time, it was like walking almost into a wonderland. You almost didn't even realize anything was going on outside of Bukavu. It's just, when you talk about complexities and you talk about things flopping into place and everything needs to be in place in order for some disaster to happen, that was exactly what I experienced. And I loved your book.
In the book, I quote Julius Nyerere, the former president of Tanzania, who was talking about Tutsi government in Burundi. And he said, you guys are like somebody riding a tiger. You're so afraid of falling off the tiger and being eaten by the tiger that you just keep on riding the tiger. And what he was talking about is that this extremely militaristic policy of self-defense. Now, if your community has been discriminated and persecuted like the Tutsi community in the Congo, you can understand why you'd have an extremely militaristic, sometimes paranoid policy of self-defense. Because so many of people that are around you have been discriminated against. Also favored at different points in time. Mobutu was great at this, favor them, marginalize them, favor them, marginalize them, very Machiavellian. But that's a serious problem, and that's not going to be solved until the Congolese have a real serious debate about nationality and what it means to be a Congolese, and whether Tutsi are true Congolese, and whether they will be accepted. It's a serious, serious, serious problem in Eastern Congo. Very, very deep. My host mother that I was staying with in Bukavu, we were talking about the Rwandan genocide, and she went on this anti-Tutsi diatribe, and I said, well, look, I know, this was Bukavu. If you were ever tortured between 1996 and 2003 in Bukavu, chances were there was a Tutsi in the room, unfortunately. And extreme amount of anti-Tutsi xenophobia and racism. And she went on this anti-Tutsi diatribe. I said, okay, but you have to admit that 500,000 or more of them were killed in Rwanda in 1994. And she said, oh, really, 500,000? That's not enough. They should have killed more.
There is a blackout of information due to a reluctance to tackle complex issues, due to a reluctance to make the American people educate themselves so that we can govern responsibly. I wonder if in your journalism you are frustrated by the inability of people to handle complexity.
This is my debate with my friend John Prendergast, for example. And I say, I understand that we need to bring this across to soccer moms in Peoria, Illinois. I understand that. And you've done a great job at doing that. But we need to push the envelope in terms of complexity. Otherwise, we're going to end up, if you have a simplistic understanding of a situation, you're going to have a simplistic answer to the situation. And so I think it's really about pushing the envelope on these issues. What is it they say in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility? We haven't really learned that lesson as an American people, I think, unfortunately.
One of the three main causes of the conflict was the weakening and dissolution of the Congolese state. Mm-hmm. And you've offered hope for the next presidential election, which on the record of elections in the Congo might be a false hope. My question is, does the future hold Congo, or will it dissolve, or how will this all end?
Now that is the billion-dollar question. And it's a billion-dollar question, I say, because the U.S. government spends $1 billion a year on the Congo. And most of the money does not necessarily probably go to the construction of viable state institutions. But that is, it's kind of the Karzai problem. How do you engage with a government that itself does not seem to be intent on creating strong institutions? How do you try to build a strong army with the government that seems to be intent on actually keeping the army factionalized? It's a very, very difficult question. I don't have a good answer for that. All I know is that I don't think that the authoritarian myth is the way to go. This idea that, we need a strong dictator to build the country up and to create strong institutions. There's no record that in the Congo that's worked. In fact, we've seen that movie before, and it's called Mobutu Sese Seko to a certain extent. So I think that the democratic route, as messy as it is the route that we have to go, and I think the route of decentralization. So maybe not breaking up the country, but certainly a strong measure of decentralization, and that's in course. The Constitution provides for that. 40% of national resources is supposed to be managed at the provincial level, and you have provincial assemblies that elect governors already, and there's indications that those at least they hold them a little bit more accountable than at the national level.
Do you think that if the last human rights abuse ended in Congo, we won't hear about these kind of things again?
So are you trying to, let me understand, are you trying to ask why we don't see the same kind of mobilization today as we did back in,
Yes. since it started in Congo, I mean, my hope will be that if we manage to solve that, what's happening in Congo now, that gives me hope that maybe we won't see it around the world again.
I see.
And that's my first question. I have another question.
Sure.
Is do you believe, because you were saying maybe it's the erosion of the institutions, do you believe that without Congo having that much resources, do you think that the Congo War will happen?
Well, I don't think that even if we end human rights abuses in the Congo, that they're going to stop all over the world. I think that power and abuse happen wherever you have human beings, unfortunately. So I don't think it's gonna stop. But the question of why there hasn't been much mobilization, there's actually been less mobilization around this issue than there was back when Joseph Conrad and Mark Twain and Arthur Conan Doyle got together to lobby against the Congo Free State of King Leopold and its abuses. It is a very valid question. It was if you remember you've seen the cartoons that were in the British press at this time in the early 20th century, turn of the century time, when this debate was taking place. The figure of King Leopold was, you'd have King Leopold as this evil sort of maniac sucking the blood from the Congo. Framing is very important. It's very important to be able to sell a narrative of the conflict. And the narrative was very clear. You have a maniacal Belgian despot who's going against the trends of history because democracy is, this is early 20th century, democracy is the way to go. Human rights was maybe not, on the table as it would be several decades from then, but was beginning to be on the table. And you had this maniacal Belgian despot who was exploiting the Congo and enslaving people after slavery had been abolished, really. This was sort of, echoes also of slavery, I think, very clearly in the debate back then. The framing was incredibly important. People rallied around this, particularly religious groups around the world, and they made a huge difference. The framing is it's been very, very difficult to frame the Rwandan genocide was easy to frame. It was a terrible thing that happened, but it was much easier to frame. The Congolese war is difficult to encapsulate in a nutshell. It's extremely difficult to catch. I challenge you to go up to anybody and in 10 seconds explain to them why they need to care about the Congo, other than the fact that a lot of people have died. It's very difficult. And I think that even though this is what I spent the last hour trying to do here, it's something that doesn't sink in with the same sort of conviction to somebody's head in Peoria, Illinois, or wherever it may be. So, which is why I have a lot of sympathy for my friends in the human rights movement who are using sexual violence and other things as a way to convince people, okay, it's complicated, forget about it's complicated, but 400,000 women are being raped a year. That should convince you. And now we're beginning to see something more like we saw back in the day of Arthur Conan Doyle and whatnot. I just saw Javier Bardem did a Mother's Day message with John Prendergast talking about the women in the Eastern Congo. This is it's sort of coming up. But it's all about being able to tell that narrative and tell that story. And if you can't, you're not going to get any traction with anybody. And I think that's the curse, or as you put it, the curse is us not rising to that challenge in the Congo, despite the fact that since the beginning our histories have been entwined with the Congo's history. There is no doubt. This is what I got interviewed this afternoon by somebody who asked me this very question. Is conflict minerals the reason behind the war in the Eastern Congo? The answer is, in 1996, when the war started, it wasn't about the natural resources. It was about geopolitics. Above all, about the refugee camps and this demise of Mobutu's state. And even today, if you got rid of the conflict minerals problem, the war would still go on. I worked on this particular issue with the UN group of experts for a long time. For an armed group in the Eastern Congo, conflict minerals is the same as palm oil or cannabis or timber. It's a commodity they can tax. That's all it is. It's like something they can tax. Now, it happens to be very easy to tax because it's a trade that you can tax, and in the case of gold, it's very easy to smuggle. So it has some particularities to it. But at the end of the day, it's a commodity you can tax. and they will tax anything they can. I mean, I investigated armed groups in the Eastern Congo who made a fortune off the charcoal trade. The charcoal trade around Goma alone is $30 million a year. It's an enormous amount. And they made a fortune off the charcoal trade. And they made almost no money off the minerals trade. The CNDP of Laurent Nkunda, for example, probably the strongest rebellion in the Eastern Congo between 2004 and 2009, made relatively little money off the mineral trade, except, well, a bit more complicated than that, but they didn't control any mines. They controlled one mine, Ibatama. But some other militias, they can control timber, and other guys do marijuana. So don't get me wrong, minerals is an incredibly important part of the conflict economy in the Eastern Congo. It's probably the most lucrative part. And in case of the demise of the Congolese state, one reason that, if you want to go way back, one of the reasons that the Congolese Free State and then afterwards the Mobutu state was run into the ground so desperately, you could argue, is because he didn't really need to tax his own people and create infrastructures. He had easily accessible, it's the resource curse, as they say, easily accessible wealth that he could draw on and tax, jacamine, copper, cobalt, etc. But I still think I still tend to think that there probably would have been a war. It would have looked differently, and it wouldn't have lasted as long in the Eastern Congo, I think. But there would have probably been a war. Yeah.
Who are the number one victims right now suffering from this war?
The Congolese people?
Everybody.
The Congolese people. The Congolese people. People get confused to who needs help right now.
Absolutely, yeah. And I don't think there's no question in this book that because it's complex, we shouldn't do anything about it. I think the book says it's complex. There's an enormous amount of urgency in doing something about it. But the first imperative, the first thing that urgency calls on at least me to do is to understand what's going on. So I don't react in a foolish way. I can give you 100 examples of during the war how people have engaged and reacted in ways that have not been very helpful. Just to bore you for 2 seconds, for example, conflict minerals. There's a big movement in the United States that I support that is calling on companies to exercise due diligence to their supply chains and to know where their minerals are coming from, to prevent the supply chains from fueling conflict in the Congo. It's a great thing. Companies have begun to freak out because of the reputational hazards. So what do? They boycott the Eastern Congo, which has led to the risk, at least, that hundreds of thousands of jobs are going to be lost in the Eastern Congo. Now, there's ways of engaging and finding a constructive middle ground, of making sure that there's investment that's accountable investment, but investment nonetheless, because you don't want to damage the economy of the Eastern Congo either. You just want to have investment that is not somehow fueling the conflict. I'm with you 100%. We need to do something. We need to do something. The first thing we need to do is understand what's going on. If there's no more questions, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.